What is up, ladies and gentlemen? In this video walkthrough, we'll be going over problem 2, hidden fruits, on the exam prep inheritance and test review worksheet. So this problem covers hiding, both variable hiding and hiding related to static methods. So if you aren't too familiar with it, that's totally okay. I think this problem will just kind of walk you through all the different types of hiding that we'll see. And yeah, let's get started. So the problem states, suppose we have the fruit and persimmon classes defined below. So we see here we have the class fruit and the class persimmon that extends fruit, right? And what we'll notice is that we have a lot of the same variables and we have a lot of these same methods, right? Okay, so now what we have here, it says, for each line below, write what, if anything, is printed after its execution. Write CE if there's a compile error, and RE if there is a runtime error. If a line errors, continue executing the rest of the lines. Got it. Okay, so how I like to approach these problems is we're usually given some sort of variables, right? So it's nice for me to keep track of the static and dynamic type of these variables, right? So in this case, we can see that the static types are the types on the left. So we can quickly fill those in. So just fruit, and persimmon. And the dynamic type are the types on the right here, right? What the object actually is, right? So Shreyas is actually a fruit. Aram is actually a persimmon. And Eric is also a persimmon. Give me a sec. And I'm just gonna make this a bit smaller so it takes up a little less space. Okay, so with this in mind, let's dive in. And the first thing it asks us is, what is Eric.flavor, right? So here's a quick rule of thumb. Let me just write this down. So when we're accessing variables, let me be a bit more specific. When we access attributes of an object, we only consider the variables of the static type. Okay, so what this really means is that when we're asked, hey, we have some Eric.flavor, we're only going to consider the static type. Okay, what this kind of means is that we're going to ignore Eric's dynamic type entirely. Okay, so what is Eric? Well, Eric's static type is a persimmon. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the persimmon class right here, and then we're going to get Eric's flavor, which is superb, right? So for the first one, let me make this one a bit smaller. Okay. So just superb. Okay. So for the next one here, we do aram.flavor, right? So when we're looking at this one, let's follow the same exact thought process, that we're only going to consider aram's static type when we're looking for this variable flavor, right? So aram is a fruit, right? Let's ignore the static type. Let's ignore the fact that aram's actually a persimmon. So let's go to his static types class, right? Let's go to the fruit class. And then we see the flavor is generic, right? So the output here is generic. And the main takeaway here is that when we're approaching problems where we have the same variable in like a parent and a subclass, the takeaway here is that we ignore the dynamic type and we only consider the static type when we're looking for that variable, right? And another important note here is that if we didn't find the variable in the flavor class, we wouldn't necessarily give up if it was the case that the class fruit extended maybe some class above it, right? Because then we can use the general rules of inheritance to say, hey, let me look up that inheritance tree. but we'll never go down the inheritance tree because we don't consider the dynamic type when we look at variables. Got it. So there's no idea of like this dynamic method selection when it comes to variables. Let me just put that here. There is no dynamic method selection for variables. Right, that's just the main takeaway. Okay, so looking at the next 3 lines, we have Eric.eat Shreyas. Okay, so what is Eric? Eric is a persimmon, and Shreyas is a fruit, right? And what we know is that if Shreyas is passed in as a parameter, we only consider the static type here, right? So what we're looking for is we're looking for an eat method in the persimmon class, right, that takes in a fruit. So we're trying to find in the persimmon class some eat method that takes in a fruit. This is ideally what we want, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, in the persimmon class, we have an eat method. One eat method takes in a fruit and the other takes in a persimmon, right? So which one do we choose here? Well, we'd rather choose this method here because a fruit is actually correct because we don't know what Shreyas' dynamic type is, right? So we're going to choose this method here because this method is actually invalid, right? Because we're trying to eat a fruit and a persimmon isn't necessarily a fruit, right? Or isn't a persimmon is a fruit, but a fruit isn't necessarily a persimmon. That was my bad there. Got it. Okay, so we're gonna print out 2. We'll just keep the colors the same. And the reason again is that we hit this return 2 right here. Okay, so the next thing that we do here is we say Eric.eat Eric. So again, let's try to understand what we're being asked. So what we're being asked is that in the persimmon class, right, because Eric is a persimmon, we're looking for an eat method, right, that takes in a persimmon, right? So we're trying to find an eat method in the persimmon class that takes in a persimmon. So we'll go up to the persimmon class, we'll say, hey, here is an eat method that takes in a persimmon. So we'll choose this method. And since Eric's static and dynamic type are the exact same, we just execute that method, right? So we'll just return 3 here. Okay. So now things get a bit trickier when we do aram.eat Eric. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to say, hey, aram is a fruit. So let's look in the fruit class, right? We're trying to look in the fruit class now for an eat method that takes in a persimmon, right? Because Eric is a persimmon. That's Eric's static type. So aram static type is a fruit, right? During compile time, we only consider the static types of these variables. So just to recap, when we see aram.eat Eric during compile time, we say, hey, we only consider the static types. So we go to the fruit class, right? Because that's Aram who's the one invoking the method. And then we say, hey, we're looking for an eat persimmon method. So we go up to the fruit class and we're looking for an eat persimmon method, but we don't find an eat persimmon method. But we don't give up because a persimmon is a fruit. So this method is valid, though it's not like the ideal method, if that makes sense. So what we're going to do is that we're going to choose this method here. Okay? Then what we're going to do is that during runtime, or during runtime, we consider the dynamic type, right? That's usually how dynamic method selection works. However, here's a really big point that I'm going to write down, is when we select the signature of a static during compile time, there is no DMS. There's no dynamic method selection. So this is a really big point here. And what we're saying is that, oh shoot, I had it perfectly selected. Okay, so yeah, basically what this point is saying is that when we choose a static method, in this case, this is a static method, there's no dynamic method selection. So during runtime, we're not even going to consider that Aram's dynamic type is persimmon. We're just going to choose the method that we locked in on during compile time, right? So just to say that once more, because it's really important, is that when we choose a static method, there is no dynamic method selection, okay? So the idea here is that this is just going to output 1 because there's no dynamic method selection when we have static methods, right? Okay, so the next two parts are aram.hats and eric.hats, okay? So when we do aram.hats, what we do is we return this dot start, okay? So it's important here to understand like what is this dot, right? So we know that aram is a fruit, right? But aram's actually like also a persimmon, so it gets kind of confusing, right? So what's important here to understand is that this keyword is in the fruit class, right? It's the this for the fruit class. So what that means is that the static of this is fruit, right? So just to recap what we've learned so far is that when we do aram.hats, right, what this does is that it calls this hats method here, right? We know there's only one hats method. There's no ambiguity of which hats method we're going to call. So when we call this hats method, what's going to happen is that we return this dot start. So this gets a bit confusing because what is this, right? This is always kind of tricky. So let's take a step back. And what we know is that this refers to the current instance that's invoking this method, right? So in this case, this is aram. But what's also important here to note is that this is in the fruit class, right? So what that means is that the static type of this is fruit, right? Because the keyword this is existing in the fruit class, so its static type is fruit. So with that in mind, what we learned from earlier is that when we access the attributes of an object, we only consider the variables of the static type, right? Well, this is an object, and we're accessing its variable or its attribute start. So we're only going to consider the static type of this, which is fruit. So we're going to look for start in this fruit class, and we output f. Okay. So let's walk through eric.hats. And I think this will be hopefully a good rundown on hiding when it comes to variables. So walking through eric.hats, let's go slowly through this process. We know that we're going to look in the persimmon class, right? Because Eric is a persimmon for a hats method. We don't find one, but that's okay because we say, hey, in my parent class, there's a hats method. So let's use that one, okay? So during compile time, we're going to choose this method here, right? Then what we're going to do during runtime is we're going to execute this code, right? So during runtime, we're going to execute this dot start. And what's important here to understand is that although Eric has a static type of persimmon, in this hats method, that this object, even though this refers to Eric, this object, since it's defined in the fruit class, right, the same logic applies here. that the static type of this is fruit, okay? So what we can kind of think to ourselves is that this variable is agnostic of like where we call this method from. Okay, so that was like a little confusing. Let me rephrase. So in the earlier example, we saw that aram, when aram was this, that aram static type was fruit, so it'd make things like a bit simpler. But in this case, since Eric's static type is persimmon, you may wonder like, why is this still having a static type of fruit, right? Because that's my claim. I think this claim is still true. That's what I'm trying to say. So the way to kind of understand that to ourselves is that this is an object that lives in the fruit class, right? So as such, the static type of an object in the fruit class is going to be fruit. So if we're currently looking at this, where this is referring to Eric, you can think about Eric's static type can change, right? So in this case, Eric's static type was persimmon, but now this object is capturing Eric, and this is static type is fruit. Okay? So in essence, we've kind of, maybe you can think about it as casting Eric's static type to this, but in essence, all we're really doing is that Eric is currently this, and this has a static type of fruit. It's that simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to return fruit.start, which is f, right? So that's all for this video walkthrough. I hope you all found it helpful, and yeah, have a good rest of your day.